Try one thing here. If everybody could take a seat, please. Who hasn't got a seat? Should I just go? I'll just go. All right. Kia ora koutou, Wamajeka, and welcome, everybody. I would like to begin by, in this last session, by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here on the banks of the Birrarung, and recall the beautiful welcome we had from Uncle Tony Garvey on day one at the National Communication Museum. And thank the Wurundjeri people for their ongoing hospitality on these lands on which sovereignty was never ceded. Those who don't know me, my name's Timothy Neale. I'm Associate Professor of Anthropology here at Deakin University. I'm also the Secretary of AusSTS. What else am I? And an editor of Science, Technology and Human Values, a journal that is very proud to be able to support this conference. This keynote panel on bodies of signals and noise. I'm not going to stand in the way of our panelists for very long here, not only because time is short. I'm not going to do anything so presumptuous as try and frame the panel's theme in any depth, and not just because time is short, but also because the initial thinking for this conference, as you're going to intimate, and this plenary in particular, were very much shaped by Chris O'Neill's translation of Michel Foucault's and commentary, excellent commentary, on Michel Foucault's 1966 essay, Message or Noise. And in that essay, as I read it, Foucault engages in a critique of the medical science's treatment of human bodies, bodies like ours, as noisy, and thereby with their epistemological tools and habits, medical science's kind of treatment of those bodies seeking signals of disease or malfunction, or even symptom in the noise. When I sent this prompt or stimulant to our panelists, Warwick responded first and said that he thought that was fine, but, quote, I may talk about something else on the day, which frankly is all right by me, and I hope all of you, because over the next hour, we are in very trustworthy hands of three fantastic scholars. Three people who personally delight me, and whose work in different ways, I think, demonstrates what is that science and technology studies does here in the Antipodes, what it looks like. It's empirically rich, it's conceptually engaged, it's critical, it's serious, it's occasionally absurd, and sometimes bemused. And so with that said, I'd like to introduce our three speakers, who are each, if they're well behaved, going to speak for 15 minutes maximum, to speak to the theme, and then we'll have a little time for questions and answers and some discussion before a wrap-up from Karina Traits around 4:30 or thereabouts, so we hope. Yes. So our first speaker will be Chris O'Neille, Christopher O'Neille, as he's known, is a Deakin University postdoctoral research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization here at Deakin University, where he studies the role of automation in contemporary biopower. He is also a 2025-2026 Fulbright Scholar at the University of Southern California, studying error as a problematic of the automated workplace. He is currently working on 2 monographs, which the world waits for with bated breath. One on the genealogy of the body in the sense of society, and the other on the biopolitical stakes of facial recognition technologies. Our second speaker is Kari Lancaster. Kari Lancaster is Professor in Social Studies of Science and Health in the Department of Social and Policy Sciences at the University of Bath, and Honorary Burnett Institute Senior Principal Fellow. Informed by STS, Health, Sociology and Policy Studies, her work focuses on the critical social study of evidence-making practices and intervention translations in health, especially in relation to drugs and infectious disease. Her current work explores the relations between science, policy, evidence, and intervention amidst transformative global changes affecting health, with a focus on outbreak and viral elimination. Kari is also a member of the editorial collective of the very good journal Science, Technology, and Human Values. Finally, our third speaker is Warwick Anderson. Warwick is Janet Dora Hine Professor of Politics, Governance and Ethics in the discipline of anthropology in the Charles Perkins Centre at the University of Sydney. He is formerly ARC Laureate Fellow and is now an Honorary Professor in the Centre of Health Equity, which he founded in the School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. A co-conspirator in post-colonial studies of science, he's written extensively on science, race and colonialism, medicine, white masculinity, kuru, cannibalism, sorcerer scientists, and autoimmunity and tolerance of self. His current research is focused on disease ecology and planetary health. And in 2023, he was rightly awarded the John Desmond Burnell Prize from the Society of the Social Studies of Science in recognition of lifetime achievement in science and technology studies. So those are our 3 speakers. I will attempt to discipline and punish them to the extent that they require. And I'd like to invite up our first speaker and hopefully get his slides going, which is Chris O'Neill. Please join me in welcoming Chris.
Yeah. How we do? Slides are up here, but not up there. Well, should we? Oh wait, no, got buttons.
Yes.
Oh yeah, there you go. Okay, good. All right. Yeah, good. Yes, thanks for that, Tim. For putting me on the spot, for putting me on this specific spot. It's it's an honor and a privilege, and it's nice to be able to speak to you all about this. Bodies of signals and noise. Basically, right. Obviously, yeah. I wanted to jump into this question through this weird 1966 essay by Foucault that I've been fascinated with for a while, and which I ended up translating last year, called Message or Noise, Message ou bruit. You could just have easily have translated as a signal or noise. Message or noise is, it's not a major work by Foucault, which is good. It's much easier to translate than when they're just these 6 pages or whatever. It's not a major work, but it is a very interesting one, I think. It's interesting, partly because it's one of the few times Foucault is using this sort of information theoretical language, which is itself funny because it turns out when you go into his reading notes in the Foucault archives, Foucault was reading a lot of information theory, particularly in the 50s when he was studying psychology, and it was information theory and cybernetics were very in vogue in psychology at the time. But then also again, when he was writing Birth of the Clinic, his archaeology of medical perception in the early 60s. And Message or Noise is a sort of mini Birth of the Clinic, really. It's a critique of the way doctors see their patients. And the piece, in fact, was a contribution to a debate which was hosted in the French medical journal Concours Médical on the way that doctors ought to diagnose. The debate was organized by this guy, Cyril Kupernik, and he was in turn responding to a book by the Anglo-Hungarian psychoanalyst Michael Balint, his work, The Doctor, His Patient, and the Illness. So in The Doctor, Balint argues for what would come to be termed patient-centered as opposed to illness-centered medicine as the ideal mode of clinical practice. Balint held that doctors should seek to better understand the sort of lived psychodynamic dimensions of their patients' conditions rather than sort of seeking to impose upon their patients a model of how an illness ought to be experienced. Kupernik was of the opinion that this was a mistake. So he writes, quote, Balint is free to believe that the patient's message is what is most important. To me, it seems crucial to make clear that during the examination, this message must be processed in just the same way that one would a pirate radio station, which is interfering with the program that you really want to listen to. So for Kupernik, Balint is wrong because he's treating what patients say as a signal, when really what patients say is noise, which corrupts the truest signal, the real signal, which is sent by illness. For Kupernik, it's an unfortunate fact of life that you need to talk to patients to find out what's wrong with them. But you can't take patients at their word. If a patient comes in and he says, I've been feeling really stressed out lately at work and, have trouble with my wife and I'm getting these chest pains, it'd be dangerous for the doctor to ask them, well, so what's going on at work? That's not what medicine is. Medicine is understanding the message that illness is sending. And what the doctor is the figure. He's the one who can tune out what's irrelevant and tune in to what matters here. So what's Foucault's contribution? What's Foucault say? What is message and what's noise? Should doctors listen to the patient or to the illness? Well, actually what Foucault says is basically a sort of pox on both your houses. Medicine joke. Yeah. And that for Foucault, so for Foucault, the idea that the doctor, is listening either to the patient or to the illness is, these are both perverse fantasies, essentially. He has this great line in Birth of the Clinic where he's making fun of what he calls the feebly eroticized encounter between doctor and patient. And in Message or Noise, he's also criticizing the kind of intimacy which is presumed by both Balint and Kupernik. He calls it a kind of ridiculous humanist homily. He's comparing them to like dopey priests. So he writes, in his practice, the doctor attends, certainly not to a patient, but nor to someone who suffers, and above all, thank God, not to a human being. He attends neither to the body, nor to the soul, nor to both at once, nor to a combination of the two. He attends to noise. Through this noise, he must hear the elements of a message. So for Foucault, illness does not send a message. The body does not send a message. What the body does is make noise, and that's it. And what doctors do when they are diagnosing patients is decoding this noise. So Foucault argues that when we discuss changes in medical knowledge and practice, what we are talking about is a change in the codes used by medicine to establish coherence over all of this noise. But at the same time, he argues that when these codes change, we have to remember that, quote, this gain over noise has not yet been secured by a unique code and perhaps never will be. Maybe a new gain will be made, but this would be thanks to a new code, etc. Since illness has nothing to say, there is no reason that a single code will come to informatize all of this noise. So why is this interesting? Basically, Foucault has used this theoretical apparatus of signal and noise to reverse the terms of the argument that both Balint and Kupernik are pursuing. Rather than a question of different targets of listening, it's a question of different styles or codes of listening. And moreover, it's a question of the body's noise, of its errancy, its aporia, which constantly challenges the legitimacy of any particular code, which challenges medicine to new styles of, well, to new listings, to new decodings. And Foucault himself, you know, he was a gay man living during a period when homosexuality was obviously still very violently pathologized by the medical establishment, a medical establishment which would, over time, in however partial and inadequate a way, be challenged to recode this kind of noise to hear queer bodies in a different way. And at the end of the article, Foucault actually calls for a project of, you know, what we need to do, we bring doctors and information theorists to rethink the clinical relationship in these terms. So for Foucault, noise here has a kind of profoundly critical and maybe even emancipatory potential. It produces this kind of interpretive asymmetry which destabilizes the clinical relationship, but sort of in favor somehow of the difference produced by the patient's body. So that's interesting. Now, the question is whether this is still, you know, a worthwhile critical project today. There's a group I've been interested in for a while called the quantified self movement. Do people know the quantified self movement? Sort of. Some people know. They were very in vogue to study a while ago, but not anymore for reasons which I'll get to. So the quantified self movement, they were a group of people. They came out of the Bay Area in Northern California in the late 2000s. They were people who were generally like exceptionally tech savvy, and they dedicated themselves to like N=1 self-experiments aimed at producing new understandings of their bodies and their lifestyle. They quantified themselves with heart rate monitors and step counters and galvanic skin response monitors and weekly biochemical analyses of their stool samples in at least one celebrated case. And yeah, this guy, Larry Smarr, he was keen on it. And they would have, he kept getting profiled, and he kept them in his fridge, and every profile is like, Larry Smarr showed me to the fridge. You know? Anyway, bit of color reporting. And, you know, they would have local and global meetups, and they would share techniques for visualizing and interpreting and collating and synthesizing, you know, these reams of data they were producing, all in an effort to decode themselves in a way that they felt the medical establishment or industry was not able or willing to do. So they took their body's noise as the material for a new program of decoding and refiguring of the body. In 2014, Dawn Nafis and Jamie Sherman published a very interesting, influential analysis of the movement called This One Does Not Go Up to 11, the Quantified Self Movement as an Alternative Big Data Practice. And Nafis and Sherman were very interested in what they saw as the critical self-reflexive capacities of the movement, and they argued that it represented the possibility for what they call soft resistance to soft biopower. So for Nafis and Sherman, the movement was valued as a way of defining a sort of new resistant form of measurement, one which would not cohere with established methods of monitoring and control. They write, the difference here cannot be thought of as a standard deviation from a norm. Rather, they are not on the same curve. Their differences are embodied in diverging practices that cannot be meaningfully assembled together using the categories in current circulation. And Nafis and Sherman's celebration of the difference here, in fact, drew upon a certain reading of Foucault's critique of medical authority in Birth of the Clinic. If for Foucault, clinical power is organized around the clinician's question, where does it hurt? Like, where's the symptom that I can get at? Quantified self offered a new way of answering that question. The sufferer of fibromyalgia, for example, for whom the question, where does it hurt, might be answered with the cry, everywhere, all the time, could now provide a kind of data portrait of their flare-ups, in turn rendering a confounding condition more legible, decodable, and hence more actionable. But then what happened? Well, in the late 2000s, so the quantified self was a kind of data avant-garde. But then in 2014, Apple launched Health as part of the core suite of apps that come pre-installed now on every iPhone. This was quickly followed in 2015 by the launch of the Apple Watch, a milestone in the popularization of wearable technologies. So what had started in the Bay Area as an alternative data practice had now made the short jump to Cupertino as a data practice to which there was seemingly no alternative. Today's 1.5 billion active iPhone users are all, whether they like it or not, self-quantifiers. The health app, you can't delete it off your phone. At a bare minimum, users are having their steps counted via the phone's accelerometer and gyroscopic sensors. But health is the cornerstone for a much more expansive collection of health data. Users are invited to monitor the steadiness of their gait, to keep track of their moods and emotions, their sleep patterns, the decibel range of music, listen to through their Apple AirPods, and many other practices and biomarkers. But has this led to an explosion of new techniques and projects of decoding? Not really. Now everybody is a quantified selfer, but the quantified self as a movement, as a critical practice, is basically moribund, I think. And even early on, the arguments, the growth in the use of self-tracking technologies had not led, and likely would not lead, to like a power shift from healthcare providers to patients, but would rather tie patients ever more tightly to medicine as an establishment and an industry, even insofar as the masses of data produced by these methods of self-quantification still actually needed to be interpreted and verified and acted upon by real medical professionals. Rather than a liberation from medical authority, the development of this model of medical practice emphasizes individual responsibility for detecting whether or not one's biological state deviates from particular norms which themselves may be constantly revised and hence themselves require constant monitoring. At the same time, once this data is in the hands of the medical industry, it's subject to the speculative calculation of probabilities of medical insurance providers who financialize the illnesses which patients are now tasked with discovering within themselves. And now we find ourselves here. 2 weeks ago, US Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy announced that wearables and health monitoring were key to his vision of MAHA, of making America healthy again. It's a way, RFK explains, that people can take control over their own health. They can take responsibility. My vision is that every American is wearing a wearable within 4 years. Something very sinister about 4 years. I don't know. RFK's proposal, I think, demonstrates that the quantified self's soi-disant divergent ways of decoding the body have now been fully recuperated within a terrifying ascendant techno-fascist imaginary, one which is both hyper-rationalist and positivist, and yet simultaneously hostile to medical or scientific reason. But we seem to have moved then from Foucault's position, where the noise of the body offered some sort of possibility for difference or even liberation, to one where it seems like a kind of trap, like the glue binding us within a proliferating web of sensors and data analytics extending into ever more intimate interstices of everyday life. Hence the question, already asked by Fabian on the first day of the conference, is noise dead? Or, as Dang suggested, also on the first day of the conference, does there remain some sort of, hauntological quality to this noise, some spooky undead quality, one which might still return to displace and unsettle any secure single code, any final articulation or rigorous distinction between life and its other, or which might still offer us a new path into thinking the question of what a body can do. Thank you.
And now, Kari Lancaster.
Thank you, Tim. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We've received extraordinary hospitality as uninvited guests on these unceded lands. I'd also like to say thanks to Tim and to Chris and the amazing AusSTS committee for inviting me to contribute to this session. As someone who's been around since the beginning of AusSTS, it's incredible to see the AusSTS community growing and thriving. And although I'm based in the UK for now, I still call Australia home, still call AusSTS home, and it's very good to be home with you all. Let me tell you a story. In 2001, a modest proposal was posited by the US Office for Research and Development in the Environmental Protection Agency. The proposal was not made by drug policy experts, but by environmental chemists outside of the drugs field. And it was for a new, non-intrusive tool to heighten public awareness of the societal use of illicitly abused drugs and their potential for ecological consequences. The scientists, the authors, speculatively asked whether drugs, like medicines and personal care products, are similarly discharged and survive in the environment, and if so, whether they have adverse effects on native biota. Regardless, so said these environmental chemists, with the newly acquired ability of environmental chemists to monitor for medicinal drugs in environmental samples, science is now afforded the rare opportunity to simultaneously advance understandings of pollution process and also to have the ability to impact public discourse and social policy on a highly controversial subject, namely the pervasive manufacture, trade and use of illegal drugs. They said this proposal was a rare opportunity which merely capitalised on science's existing capabilities in analytic chemistry. In the drug policy field, wastewater-based epidemiology has generated worldwide interest in the last decade, given its promise to provide near real-time data on the geographical and temporal trends on the use or presence of illicit drugs. It's now routinely used in global surveillance by the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime in their World Drug Report and by the European Drugs Agency, and here in Australia by the Australian Police. It's said to have advantages over other surveillance methods as it promises to produce estimates based on direct capture of material traces of substances rather than second-hand reports or indirect indicators of use. In this messy world of drug epidemiology, this is a technical claim to cleaner, more accurate evidence. It's a technoscientific solution that purportedly cleans up the mess and tunes out the noise. But, as our very own Warwick Anderson has noted in his recent book, Spectacles of Waste, while it is tempting to reduce this story to a homily about technical advances, this is no relaxed quest for knowledge, no naive following of the science. Something more heartfelt is at stake. As with COVID-19 and what Anderson has described as the fetishising of excrement, the field of drug policy has, for a decade now, been locked onto the promissory value and potential risk of shit. Waste, and sewage especially, provides a fertile site then for considering the relations and complex entanglements of bodies, health and environments. But what are we to make of these shitty signals? Or more precisely, and in keeping with the Foucauldian thinking that frames this panel, with what manner of attention might we listen to the noise? I want to suggest that rather than closing down or simplifying the trouble of drugs, wastewater-based epidemiology might be understood as multiplying complexities, demanding renewed attention to the biotic dimensions of drugs as they entangle with different environments, thus reformulating the trouble of drugs as not only a problem of human health, but as an ecological concern. And if my fellow panellists will permit me a brief Latourian divergence from our Foucauldian framing, as a way into this analysis, I began by thinking with Bruno Latour's concept of purification. There was something about thinking shit with purification that just seemed to make sense. As a way of kind of thinking about how these claims to more accurate, cleaner evidence are made, and also thinking about the multiple effects of those claims. So Latour, of course, famously addresses the problematic of modernity and draws attention to how this modernist stance, through the practices of purification, work to make distinctions between nature and society, human and non-human, but also how these practices work alongside hybrid networks that mix and link in one continuous chain politics, science, technology, and nature. The science of wastewater-based epidemiology is an attempt at purifying the trouble of drugs, but the purification of drugs coming to be known through these signals of a purportedly more accurate science does not clean up the mess of drugs, harms, and their evidencing. In their enactments in the science of wastewater epidemiology, drug objects, of course, continue to entangle not only politically and socially, but also through their purification, now also environmentally. So we can start with what has become a really important paper published in 2014. There's a link to this paper on the European Drug Agency's wastewater-based epidemiology and drug topic page, which in turn links to the UNODC World Drug Report methodological annex. This is the thing to cite if you're writing about drugs and wastewater epidemiology. We are told that monitoring a complex, hidden, low prevalence, stigmatised behaviour such as illicit drug use is a difficult task, and conventional approaches face methodological challenges. Among these are the possible response and non-response biases that are associated with self-report data. Consumers may simply be unaware or misinformed about the drug they are consuming. So here we see the cleaning up of the trouble of drugs through a technical solution. Drug use is complex, it's hidden, it's stigmatised. We are told that the self-reported accounts of people who use drugs can't be trusted. Monitoring is costly, it's time-consuming. Wastewater-based epidemiology purportedly cleans up this mess. It tunes out the noise. It provides objective and near real-time estimates. So through these methods, the trouble of drugs, problematised here as illicit and uncertain, is remade as measurable and knowable through these practices of purification which separate human and non-human. This is an epidemiology which is striving for a purely technical engagement with drug objects as they are, separated from bodies, social life and practices. In these practices of purification, there's the silencing of drug use, a tuning out of noisy bodies, of people and their social worlds and the settings where drug use happens. But it's through those purifying practices that the drug itself, these chemicals, these metabolites, emerge as a singular explanation of harm. The first thing to say is that this, of course, erases several decades of social research, which has understood drug use as a socially mediated practice and which has located drug effects not in their intrinsic qualities, but in an assemblage of drug set and setting or risk environment. But here we find it's the mere presence of drug object, of chemical, that equates with harm potential. And this is where we notice the new hybridities emerging. With drugs materialised as objects of harm in and of themselves, the mere presence of the drugs in the very water in which they are being measured then becomes a site of risk and harm. Wastewater itself then becomes another setting in which the trouble of drugs is made manifest. So it's at this point that the separations of human and non-human and the social settings of drug use and drugs themselves once again become entangled as a new concern. Drugs are beginning to announce themselves as an environmental problem. So let's unpack this. Tracing wastewater-based epidemiology methods over time, we can begin to see how this separation of drug use and drug objects has changed the articulation of what wastewater epidemiology is actually doing, what this science is actually for, how its signals are being read. So here on the left is a diagram from that 2014 paper outlining the main steps of the method, which I won't go through. And on the right is an image from the World Drug Report. So the inherent and assumed potential for drug harm is here being made as a transferable concept. Suddenly, in the pages of the World Drug Report, we find the trouble of drugs affecting not only humans, but also fish and other organisms. For those of us in the field of public health who advocate for greater attention to ecological configurations in public health and epidemiology, Perhaps this is not such a bad thing. But let's look at how this signal is constituted through associations. The potential for drug harm is a transferable concept, and the signal here is translated perhaps all too quickly with recourse to something that feels distinctive and recognisable in medicine, that is, a diagnostic category of addiction. Here we have brown trout going through withdrawal. We're told here in the pages of the World Drug Report that the emissions of controlled drugs into freshwater ecosystems can cause addiction, with adverse consequences for individual fish and the population at large, especially in relation to foraging and mating. The account given of these fish sounds all too familiar for those of us who work in the drugs field, reminiscent of, as they are, of the categories and constructs of the highly critiqued Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5 criteria. And it's not only the brown trout in withdrawal and seemingly meeting DSM criteria for drug dependence. Wastewater epidemiology, through its separations, proliferates concern with eels in rehab. Eels are getting high on cocaine, appearing hyperactive. Meth gators also emerge, their hyperaggression caused by drugs down the toilet. We have the question being posed, will trout end up loitering around sewage pipes? I'm assuming presumably with their school bags, vaping, getting up to no good. As the drug object emerges as this singular explanation of potential harm in the absence of the social settings and practices of drug use itself, through these technoscientific practices of wastewater surveillance programs, these presumed drug effects are extended across nation states, as well as land and aquatic environments, into new spaces and now new species. Such is what Latour would call our paradox here. The clean separation of measurable drug objects from the complexity of bodies and social worlds, in fact, does the work of entangling them again anew in environments. The natural world has until recently really been largely missing from accounts of drugs and drug use, but these particular ecological renderings and readings of the signals quite understandably have produced quite a lot of disquiet within the drug policy community about how and why this should be made to matter. I want to suggest that these are not complexities to be ignored or erased, but worked with in new ways. The job is whether we have sufficiently sharpened our cognitive toolkit for the job. So as I move towards a conclusion here, I want to say that in this analysis, I think we've seen how wastewater has come to shape epidemiology and drug policy science in very particular ways, most notably in the form of what could be described as a kind of attempt at an ecological turn, as wastewater analysis has travelled from environmental science into drug policy and back again, becoming transformed in these moves. But I also want to argue that in this move towards the purification of shit as a form of more accurate and reliable evidence for drug policy, ecological thinking has taken a bit of a twisted turn. In its pursuit of this more accurate, cleaner evidence, desperate for biomedical and technoscientific fixes, the signals have become a bit muddled, perhaps silencing too much noise, tuning it out far too much and far too prematurely. As drug policy attempts to take this ecological turn by awkwardly making sense of signals through its over-reliance on the biomedical category of addiction, do we need to pause and say, nice try, but maybe wrong way, go back? As Warwick, Sonia and I have noted in our recent essay on epistemic preparedness, there's an urgent need to draw attention to our inherited epistemic techniques in public health and draw collaboratively on insights from social sciences and health humanities, as well as sociological and ecological analyses of social medicine, planetary health, and One Health. Ecological analyses imagined differently can take into account, for example, ecosystem destruction, biodiversity loss, climate change, socioeconomic determinants of health, effects of discrimination and intolerance, narrowly partisan politics, colonial legacies, and the multiple structural violences of global capitalism. These are conceptual frameworks that allow us to attend to the more than human dimensions of health. These ways of thinking demand not a tuning out, but different ways of attuning to the noise in all of its noisiness. So I want to ask, in conclusion, how noise might be remade as an ecological engagement, not reduced to shitty signals, overly reliant on hegemonic diagnostic biomedicalized categories. But I want to think about how we might attune to the noise and make meaningful the extending set of relations between drugs, bodies, environments on a damaged planet. There is an urgent need for public health to sharpen its toolkit if we are to respond to issues at a time in our present history that is characterised by political instability and shifting landscapes of scientific governance alongside climate destruction and widening social and economic inequalities, all of which are affecting drug use harms and our responses to them. So a move towards ecologies then entails new associations, new translations, no longer attributing harms as the effect of object drug chemicals, but of noticing the hybrids that emerge, shifting attention, paying attention, attuning to the combination of how drugs, human bodies, animal bodies, and their environments, as well as how epidemiological technologies and regimes of drug surveillance and control come together in the circumstance of their meeting. And as critical scholars such as Martin Zawransky and Warwick Anderson have argued in their respective work, truly attuning to the present conditions of our unstable planet may require us to bring into question and force us to reconfigure even ostensibly progressive aspects of biomedical and environmental sciences like ecological thinking and planetary health. For it is precisely in the wake of the often devastating effects of extractive scientific, industrial, material, and political imperatives of progress as a linear alternative to regress that many of the problems of health inequities may be situated. So Foucault reminds us to think of the consequences of signals and noise, here not only for drugs and health, but for environments and the living. For Foucault, there is, of course, as Chris has noted in his essay, only noise all the way down. The important thing is how we listen. Thank you. And I will conclude with a shameless plug of Science, Technology and Human Values Journal. Please send us your papers.
Thank you, Kari. And now our last speaker of the panel. Disconnect here because he has no need of such things. Warwick.
I'm not sure I have no need of them. I just don't have them. All right, thank you very much. I'm still thinking about the loitering trout. Actually, it's hard to get out of my mind now. After the two excellent papers like that, I have a feeling that whatever I have to say now is redundant. But I go on regardless. Now, my apologies for not having been at the whole of the meeting. There was a conflict in Sydney that I couldn't escape. But I have greatly enjoyed today's presentations. It's been wonderful, actually. I've learnt so much from all of them, and I wish I could have been here the whole of the conference. I've also been very impressed by the somewhat disturbing fidelity to the themes of noise and signals. But again, regardless, I will also show my loyalty to the theme in this presentation. I'm very pleased to be back in Melbourne, or Naarm as we seem to call it now. I actually grew up on Gadu Bunud land, about 2.5 hours southwest of here, and then lived not far from here on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land. The extraordinary thing is that when I was growing up, all of this was silent. There was no noise, there was no signal, there was nothing. There was a silence about this. so it's good that it's changed. So I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. I now live on the land of the Wangal of the Eora Nation, which in what's now called the Balmain Peninsula in Sydney. And again, I'd like to acknowledge that. So what I'm going to say very briefly, actually, is just a few words about noise as an attention ecology, if you like, or perhaps an attention hauntology. And I think they're more or less the same, the way I'm using ecology anyhow. If we go back to Foucault, the later Foucault, I see this as an exercise in the eruption of subjugated unknowables rather than subjugated knowledges, as Foucault said. But anyhow, subjugated unknowables. Yeah. So in his early structuralist phase, Michel Foucault was evidently much taken by cybernetics, as Chris O'Neill has pointed out. Cybernetics being the Cold War science of communication and control. And in this, he was not alone among French theorists. His teacher, Georges Canguilhem, along with his rivals, Roland Barthes and Jean Baudrillard, and of course, Claude Lévi-Strauss as well. They all drank deeply from the brew, maybe it was the Kool-Aid, of Norbert Wiener's cybernetics and Claude Shannon's information theory. Canguilhem and Foucault were preoccupied with turning noise into messages, as we've heard, with a theory of information processing in the biomedical sciences. Chris has spoken eloquently about this. Whereas Barthes and Baudrillard, like many post-structuralists, protested against cybernetic efforts to eliminate noise from the system to enhance communication. While they liked the idea of cybernetics, they thought the elimination of noise had gone too far. So in other words, some French theorists, including the early Foucault, wanted to ontologize noise, while others perceived noise as a valuable hauntology. And my sympathies, as you may expect, are with the latter group, or as Baudrillard later put it, forget Foucault. So accordingly, at a very early stage in my presentation, I'd like to abandon Foucault and turn to different studies of noise as disconcerting tension or disturbing tone, in effect to noise as spectre. From Michel Serres' The Parasite, I learned how spectres act as noise or interference in the system, disorienting existing relations or tonalities while creating others. In Serres' terms, the spectre thus is a parasite, a plurimodal, inapparent presence, disrupting complacent ontologies, a thermal inciter of turbulence and disorder, perhaps undecidable, not in itself signifying anything, not in itself communicative, but amplifying opportunities for communication and for interference. Such hauntings turn the host into a complexly relational and connected quasi-subject, or what I'd be inclined to call a para-subject. Serres, therefore, is arguing in favour of noise and not flattening, parasitism and not separation or effacement, symbiosis and not autonomy. Without noise, we would have nothing more than simple autologous replication and reiteration. Another way of putting this, if one wanted to shift into a linguistic register, is to say that the spectre serves as a preposition, preposing itself, engendering temporal and spatial ties, acting as a necessary, indeclinable part of language and thought. So not exactly static or noise, perhaps, certainly not white noise in this reframing, but still possibly interference or buzz or distortion of auditory feedback. So different from the smooth and linear cybernetic feedback. Jacques Derrida and Serre, who knew each other well, I believe, appear to have been thinking along similar lines. For Derrida, value is constructed in reference to a haunting. The effect of respect for the spectre is to multiply undecidability, to render the uncanniness of the situation, to interrupt teleological time, to inspire an action, such as diagnosis, perhaps. A hauntology thus disturbs an ontology, overthrows a hegemony. The challenge, according to Derrida, is how to satisfy our responsibility to let ghosts speak, is what he says, or how to give them back speech, to quote Derrida, even if it is in oneself, in the other, or in the other, in oneself. Yeah, classic Derrida. But by speech, Derrida seems to mean a ramifying of relations, a proliferation of connections, a complicating of communications, not distilling a simple message or a signal from the noise in the clinic, for example. Ontology, if I may quote Derrida again, always a dangerous thing to do. Ontology opposes it, and I think he means the noisy haunting, only in a moment of exorcism. Ontology, he writes, is a conjuration. So it brings us back to the problem of what we expect a haunting, noise in the system, in other words, to do. To overthrow a hegemony and disturb communication, or to instruct and guide us, convey a message or a signal, to license some spokesman, a clinician perhaps, to make explicit signals that otherwise would be hidden or obscure. Well, noise as a hauntology, in contrast, I think, evokes a subjunctive mood, expressing wishfulness, emotion, possibility, and unreality, a conditional tense. That is, spectrality insists on the betrayal of linear progressive history. Mark Fisher observed that hauntology, I quote him, hauntology is the proper temporal mode for history made up of gaps, erased names, and sudden abductions, end quote. It allows us to listen for what he called the relics of the future and the inactivated potentials of the past, to hearken to colonial dispossession and dyschronia, or temporal disjunction rather. It's to feel the seams in cultural production and maybe to create new and unexpected relations and connections. And I believe this is something that we in STS should be doing, not just reconstructing biomedical ontologies out of the noise of the body. Now, I'd like to return for a moment to ghosts as noise in systems of reason and practice. As Serre put it, noise is the basic element of the software of all our logics, or it is to logos what matter used to be to form. That is, it works to generate static rather than specific signification. Found sound produces chaotic multiplicity, turbulent relationality. Ghosts, therefore, are not oracles, not definite social figures. Rather, they disturb self-possessed contemporary ontologies, unsettling conventional answers. Ghosts then may resemble perseverations or insistent, seemingly meaningless repetitions that can be uttered in some neurological conditions. Thus, spectrality is not, for example, a patient's subject position or a clinician's point of view. It is an inchoate insurrection, a denial of system and closure, containment and ending. As Mark Fisher put it, if the metaphysics of presence rests on the privileging of speech and the here and now, then the metaphysics of crackle, noise, crackle, he says, is about dyschronia and disembodiment. So we cannot control ghosts by granting them a voice or by socialising them or by enrolling them in pedagogical exercises. We should let them get on with their work without demanding they allocute in the terms of our times. It is the ghostly indeterminacy of noise that matters in the end. So I'm grateful to Chris O'Neill for drawing our attention to Foucault's 1966 essay, Message or Noise. If nothing else, it has caused me to reflect on why it fails to resonate with me. And on the ways that it draws attention to the ways, for me, Serre and Derrida continue to echo. If I'd had more time, I might have said more about Philippe Lacoue-Labart's 1975 essay, The Echo of the Subject, about the audition rather than the visualization of the subject, and about Jean-Luc Nancy's notion of le corps sonore, the sonorous body, as described in his book Corpus. Instead, though, I'll leave you with John Cage. Late in the 1950s, John Cage became fascinated by indeterminacy or lack of control in musical composition, claiming, I quote him, the purpose of indeterminacy would seem to bring about an unforeseen situation. An unforeseen situation. From the early 1960s, popular music has also turned to the spectral disturbance of sound, resorting to distortion, even buzz and hum, to disconcert any simple melody, to disorder seriality and temporal linearity, to reanimate sound in undetermined ways. To me, this sounds like an important agenda for critical science and technology studies. Thank you.
Here, we're going to get some mics. Oh, thank you. I'll invite our speakers up here. So we have a small amount of time for questions from the audience, and two things to say about that. One, make sure it's a question. Do dwell with it for a moment, and if it is a question, I have prizes. Come see me later. You'll get a prize from me even if it's a bad question. I'll still give you a prize. Do we have any for our three great speakers? Well, okay, over here.
Thanks to all of you. That was really engaging talk. Samuel Bilby from University of Western Australia. Yeah, really engaging across all of your talks. And the thing I kept kind of coming back to, especially ending on Warwick's talk with that tour de force of philosophy and stuff, was going back to this idea of hauntology, and particularly in reference to the end of Chris's talk when you talked about the emancipatory potential of hauntology. The thing that I was drawn to with that was the sort of thinking through the allegory of Gilbert Simondon's metastability, if that's something that might be of relevance to this conversation. But more specifically, I guess I'm going to open up the whole question to everyone, but specifically, I suppose, to Chris. What do you see as potentially, like, you cited all of these bodily metric technologies at the end of your talk. In regards to this kind of like potential for emancipatory ends, yeah, where do you see this as heading, and might there be some recuperation of those technologies into some sort of concerted effort that is emancipatory?
Yeah, well,
question, sorry.
That's great. I mean, the thing, there's always recuperation. That's the problem. That's the thing. That's not a reason not to try something. But in terms of hauntology and emancipation, I mean, I don't know, like, okay, like we get in Warwick says, I'm going to do like a forget Foucault thing, and it's like, would that we could, you know what I mean? Like, that's the problem, it's the inheritance of Foucault for thinking these kind of questions, But I think there's two things there, that especially Warwick's paper, brings out so well, and that's in particular, the problem of care as an ethical problem within the eruption of noise, and that's not because the thing too, which I'm not going to go too much into genealogies of frog philosophers, but like so Warwick's brought up Canguilhem, and Derrida and Foucault were both Canguilhem's students, and they were sort of vying for. I don't know, there's a lot of prestige around Canguilhem. And Canguilhem was, the whole message or noise thing is kind of riffing on Canguilhem a bit, because Canguilhem was obsessed with the problem of the health is the silence of the body. You have to be attentive to noise of the body for Canguilhem is suffering. And what Canguilhem was worried about in terms of the informationization of the body was that you lose sight of suffering. Canguilhem, suffering is like the normative kind of like telos of that's what medicine is for. And that's kind of what Foucault, he's with his. He had a pretty bad experience with the medical industry. He's trying to explode that. It's a much more Nietzschean sort of affirmationary kind of thing. It's just like, let's just like roll the dice and like, all right. But this is, I'm sort of getting, I think that's inadequate, basically. So I think I think Derrida has a much better account of the ethical relations of care. And then the other element is obviously like Foucault's a great thinker of the relation between like political economy and the life sciences and the order of things and so forth. But I don't think he adequately considered like the political economy kind of capture of this sort of injection of code into the body and the kind of monetization and sort of speculative economy of the body's noise and collapse and so forth. So I don't know what that means in terms of emancipation, but yeah, I don't know. We all have to try and forget Foucault. Yeah.
Well, at least the early Foucault. I still find later Foucault.
He's all right.
Very valuable. But look, it's interesting you mentioned care. I was just thinking about care then. And I mean, I think what I'm talking about, and I imagine what Sarah was talking about, is the noise of the body that is uncareable, in a sense. That care itself is an attempt to recuperate an ontology, a meaning, out of noise, rather than trying to live with noise as interference, distortion, buzz, hum, crackle, all that sort of thing that really it sort of can elicit relations, make connections without actually allocute in conventional terms. Another question.
Okay, you've done us this favor. Now I'm expecting a prize, even though my question will be terrible. So I apologize in advance. But maybe I'm a bit obsessed. But I'm really curious to hear more about the kind of like resistant potential of noise in especially Chris's and Professor Anderson's talk. And this is inspired by John Cage, who you mentioned at the very end, right? Who of course works with indeterminacy, but in a very strategic way, right? Like if you see a John Cage piece, all the parts where there's randomness, it's like, you know, strategically placed randomness in a very particular way, strategically placed. So I'm wondering, is noise really equal to indeterminacy, or what is the relation there? And I want to go back there to biology, right? Where it seems to me that the problem is not the modeling of noise, or the resistant potential is not in the modeling of noise, but in the modeling of very complex structure. And the example here for me would be, for instance, stuff like protein folding, right? Where we go from structure to structure, from DNA to a three-dimensional molecule. Both we can describe perfectly. We don't know the transition from one to the other. So there's no noise here in a sense. And still we're failing time and again in modeling this. So if you could speak a little bit about, if you like, about the relationship of indeterminacy and noise.
I mean, we were speaking in an earlier session about what noise stands in for at this conference. And I think the adherence to kind of everyone using the word signal and noise, it's like, what are we actually talking about after a while? And it's nice to come back to this conversation in order to try and work that through. Indeterminacy is one proposal. In the session we were in earlier, we were talking about complexity as well. And I think there's something being unpacked here in kind of our working through our relationships or rejections of Foucault and everything we know and have come from, about also the relationships between health and disease as well, and how medicine imagines those things. And I'm particularly indebted to Monica Greco's work in this space, who is a scholar of cognitism as well, in thinking about how those two things don't necessarily have to be thought together. And one of the interesting conversations I've been having, this is a bit of a side point, but I've been having with Monica since moving to the University of Bath, is the University of Bath is a university without a medicine faculty. So we've been talking about what does it look like to do health without medicine. And some of the technologies I think that Chris has highlighted in his paper as well highlight that the quantified self, I think, is a kind of gesture towards health without medicine, or a particular kind of noise that could help rethink some of these things. And I think the urgency of our times requires a rethinking of even some of these things that we hold so incredibly solid, or that seem so already well theorized in all of our inherited ways of thinking about these things. So how can we open them up anew in order to bring on the revolution, in order to bring about some kind of radical rethinking that responds to the conditions of a damaged planet?
Yeah, I'd just say that, of course, once indeterminacy can be expressed or recognised, it's not really indeterminate at that point. But what it seems to do, I think, is index complexity and a certain sort of ecological relationality that is often denied in the sort of standard scientific and sociological metaphysics of presence, really. And so I think that's what we do in good critical STS, is actually draw attention to that. This is what I was talking about, attention ecologies or attention hauntologies. And I think what we're doing is drawing attention to that. Of course, some people in STS prefer to, do policy-related stuff. That's fine too, but I think that's a different form of STS. And I was being an advocate for a critical STS, which, while it's not, baptize, and form or something like that, which is basically beyond expression, unutterable, but it is actually indexing a complexity that otherwise is hidden, denied. Yeah.
though I very much hear your message, Warwick, about the denial of closure and the embrace of unforeseen circumstances, the linearity of time marches on. And so we must unfortunately call an end to this panel, but I'd like everybody to join me in thanking again our wonderful panel, Chris O'Neill, Warwick Anderson, and Kari Lancaster. All right. So speaking of bodies and signals, I, like you all, feel the premonitory urge of a end of conference drink, but we are not quite there yet. So I need to do two pieces of housekeeping. The first is the organizing committee have got a little token of our appreciation for our fantastic co-chairs, Chris O'Neill and Kari